To kick things off, allow me to introduce our presenter. He is the Director of Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division at UN ESCAP, where he leads the team that analyzes economic trends and development challenges in Asia and the Pacific. His work focuses on finding policy and financing solutions to help countries achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Before joining UN ESCAP in 2014, he served as Director of the Monetary Policy Department at the Central Bank of Pakistan. He earned his PhD in economics from McMaster University in Canada in 2002. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mr. Hamza Ali Malik for his presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Arbeta. Thank you very much, PIDS colleagues. Thank you very much, fellow panelists, for joining us today. It's indeed a privilege to be here in person, taking advantage of some other work. So thank you for your flexibility and in hosting us in sharing the findings of our research. Just a quick word on the publication itself. This is how it looks this year. We do less and less hard copies, so I encourage you to go online, but there are a few copies I left with Dr. Rivera, so you can have a look at that. This is the longest running publication of its kind in Asia and the Pacific in print continuously since 1947. Up until 1978, it was the only publication of the region in the sense providing a regional economic assessment, which promotes peer learning across countries. Since then, of course, IMF, World Bank, OECD, many of the organizations have started producing regional economic assessments as well. Number two, this is the only publication in the UN system in Asia and the Pacific for which the Secretary General of UN, Mr. Antonio Guterres himself, writes a foreword. So this is indeed the flagship publication of ESCAP in place. I'm representing today at my team, which I'm assuming have joined me online in Bangkok. We take a lot of pride in this lineage, in this tradition, and the importance given to it by the senior management across ESCAP here and globally. There are two parts to this publication every year. One is the more traditional economic assessments, essentially 1 or 2 years horizon, what's going on right now, what are the near-term immediate risks and challenges, what can be done about that, and that's about it. The second part tends to be focused on a research theme, so for which we pick a research theme and we go deeper into those areas. Now, so for the last several years, we have talked about issues of governance and productivity, inequality, resilience, sustainability, more recently on debt, and this year we are focusing on macroeconomic climate change nexus. One feature this is slightly different this year is we actually deliberately have picked the theme where we're going to work for next 2 years instead of 1 year alone. So this is in a way round one of our findings, laying the land, lay of the land essentially. What exactly are the kind of questions we should be interested in? What are we highlighting? How we are approaching the subject? And next year, we're going to delve much more deeper into the policy side of it. So in a way, it's going to be a continuation of our research going forward. So let's jump into the publication itself. Basically, it has 5 chapters. So there are sort of 5 bullet points summarizing the main messages of each chapter. The first 2 ones are pertaining to our economic assessments that I was talking about. I'll show you some visuals of that in a minute. Overall, in Asia and the Pacific, economic performance is what we call doing quite okay, resilient, quite steady, although global tensions and uncertainty is rising. Mind you, this publication was finalized before the latest round of US tariffs. It went into print in March, and some of the announcements were made early April. So those impacts are not fully accounted for, although to some extent, we have been anticipating and seeing some rise in protectionism for a while now. So there is commentary and assessment on those lines, however, not to the extent the way it's been evaluated now. The more interesting question we ask is, in the context of economic performance, is number 2. Basic question, simple question: where is the growth coming from in the region over the coming several years, looking beyond next 1 or 2 years? Right? What should we, as UN ESCAP, advise governments when it says, try and pursue these ideas if you want to have sustained economic growth, which is also consistent with the overarching ambitions of countries of having inclusive and sustainable development in their economies? So this year we focused on this question. This is what we are essentially arguing. The region needs to revive productivity growth. And for that, we are arguing for a more, what you call, state-led developmental role focused on sectoral economic upgrading. The last 3 points essentially about the theme part of the research, as macro climate nexus. So we'll talk about those things. We highlight how they are related. They're very complex challenges, back and forth through multiple channels. We assess the readiness of Asia-Pacific countries. We define readiness in a certain particular way, their exposure plus their ability to deal with climate change. And then we provide where the countries are, and we stop at that. As I said, next year, we're going to delve deeper into some policy actions that countries can consider. So a quick word on the latest developments. These are more standard kind of assessments. I'm sure you're all familiar with these kind of charts in every economic seminar. The GDP growth trend, these are the average for the Asia-Pacific region and for inflation. This is what I mean. The line that you see is steady, the blue line, since the pandemic, slightly trajectorying downwards. And that's what prompted the question, what are the long-term trends in a way? And the red dotted lines are essentially our assessment and forecast for the next 2 years, which probably will be revisited very soon because of the latest developments, as I was referring to. If you do an eyeballing, there's one thing I want to highlight. For instance, before pandemic, the average of Asia-Pacific growth was around 5.5% or so. Now it's trajectorying below 5%. So on average, region as a whole is growing slightly less. Natural question is it a one-off thing because of the pandemic, or is some permanent trend that is setting in? And if so, what are the reasons? And this is what I'm going to share. Productivity slowdown actually is one factor. Similarly, on inflation, the region as a whole is now coming back to where it used to be. It's still slightly higher. Still, there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the future monetary policy stance or inflationary trends. But overall, it's coming back to where it used to be, hovering around a little under 4%, 3.5% or so. So these are the 1 or 2 year bullets on economic assessments. Same figure for Philippines. I don't need to share that with you in detail. You know that better than I do. Philippines is doing better than the region on average overall, including in Southeast Asia. So the blue line here is actually Southeast Asia, our sub-region, and red is the Philippines. Same two indicators, real GDP growth and inflation. This is what Dr. Rabeta was referring to as well. Overall, the macro performance of Philippines at the moment is looking pretty steady. However, there are always things that can be improved. There are challenges on the horizon. There are other considerations that need to be paid attention to. So hopefully we'll talk about that in detail. When we look at the region as a whole, not everything is always about risks and something. There are always tailwinds as well. And we'll circle back to these aspects in a minute in the context of climate change also. So number one, we are seeing robust capital investments in the region in high-tech, digital, and green sectors in particular. The scale is pretty large. There are opportunities to be had in terms of sustaining long-term growth trends. Second, the Chinese government has announced stimulus measures for its support its own economy, which is likely to have a lot of positive spillovers. Why we highlight China? Because when we look at the average assessment of the entire region, China accounts for about 40 to 42% of region's GDP. So whatever happens in China actually ends up affecting the average performance of the region, and then of course through its linkages through trade and investment has direct impact on several countries as well. And third is the intra-regional FDI flows have actually increased quite a bit, and that has been going on prior to the latest round of trade tensions and trade protectionism tendencies, which is a very heartening sign. The region, I think, is maturing quite a bit in terms of attracting foreign direct investment, especially in Southeast Asia region that is going quite strong. In terms of headwinds, I think we're all aware of that. I'm sure some will here and we'll discuss this aspect a bit more after the presentation. Rising global trade protectionism. So what you see in the left-hand side, for instance, is, as you can see, it's up until November 2024. So not capturing the latest round. This is a standard measure of WTO, trade coverage of new import restrictive measures. There was an upsurge in these restrictive measures back in 2017, 2018, up until 21. Earlier, the US, China, essentially trade war primarily. Right-hand side is something we included on the 2nd April when the new tariffs were announced. Simply trying to assess which countries can be affected more and by how much. So this is not providing the assessment yet, because as you know, the policy has been on pause from 9th April onwards. So this is simply showing the extent of exposure. So horizontal axis is showing the share of exports to the US of these countries, and the vertical axis is simply showing the new tariffs that were announced. We don't know, are we going to go back to the same level of tariffs after the pause is unlifted, or are there going to be new changes? Too much uncertainty right now. So it's too early to comment and try and give some numerical kind of assessments. But as you can see, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, all Southeast Asian countries, are quite exposed in terms of their share of their exports to the US. So they will be affected quite a bit. But as we know, negotiations are underway, bilateral between these countries and US. So let's see how it turns out at the moment. But it's going to have an impact on the region. There's going to be a lot of adjustments taking place for sure. Trade not going to US, maybe transferred to here within the region or not. It all remains to be seen at the moment. Other challenge is something we have been highlighting since our assessment on pandemic. So it's not about GDP growth, inflation only that we should care about as economists. There are other aspects as well, right? So sometimes we will comment on poverty trends. We highlight what is the impact on inequality trends of the growth patterns, how much growth processes are contributing to environmental damage, and so on and so forth, right? So this one issue of employment has been consistently highlighted by us in our several publications. Over here, I'm simply showing a focus on youth unemployment in particular. Earlier, we have been highlighting not all economic sectors have recovered equally in terms of employment since pandemic. Here, we're highlighting youth unemployment is still a concern across Asia-Pacific countries on the board. The other one is the debt distress or a limited fiscal space in general. Again, you can see some South Asian countries in particular, Sri Lanka, my home country, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Fiji, they're quite extended exposed. I mean, look at the size of interest payment on the public debt consumed, is consuming the revenues of these governments, right? So their interest payments on public revenue, it's approaching 60%. 60% of the revenues is just going towards interest payments, very little being left to essentially do other things running the country. Naturally, there are going to be issues of further increases in public debt. And that's why debt levels are a major concern across the globe and in many, many Asia-Pacific countries as well. So that's the fundamental challenge countries are confronted with. If they want to revive their economies, if they want to pursue certain ambitions on the sustainable development front, it requires investment included by the public sector. However, limited fiscal space makes it harder to pursue, to go on those lines. So our policy considerations are pretty a bit standard. We have been advising governments not to rush into, for instance, cutting the interest rates, given that the inflation has been on a downward trajectory. We've been saying remain vigilant, wait and see a little bit more. Overall, countries have been pursuing this approach so far. Similarly, use the opportunity of or need or importance of the fiscal investments, or public sector investments, focus on boosting fiscal space on all three aspects, on the revenue side, on the spending side, on the debt management side. This is something, again, we have been consistently writing and highlighting how to go about doing that. And there are a lot of specific areas where we have gone further detail. I won't go in the detail in the interest of time. Second one, which you're going to touch a little bit more later, is safeguard regional value chains. This is something that is likely to be impacted in a big manner because of the current tariffs being considered. So the adjustments, especially small enterprises, will be affected or can be affected quite drastically. Governments will need to support them during the transition period. Looking beyond a little bit, what's typically called escaping the middle income trap or addressing long-term growth concerns or how to enhance productivity, all these are related kind of questions. Beyond 1 or 2 years, where is the growth coming from and what's happening? So first thing we do is we document, we show the two things, what's happening in the data. Slower income convergence and labor productivity growth. This income convergence slowness is actually quite pronounced. It's very interesting. It's been there for 30, 35 years. The left-hand graph is showing the gross national income per capita of countries relative to the US, taken as a benchmark for advanced countries. So except China, which has caught up quite a bit, others have not caught up much. Actually, out of the 44 countries we studied, 25 have actually regressed. Only 19 have actually gained a little bit. What you see is the sub-region averages for North and Central Asia and South and Southwest Asia, and examples of India and China as countries are highlighted. But income convergence is not happening and overall has actually slowed down. Linked, of course, that is productivity trends. So you see in the right-hand side, there are four bars dividing the period in 4 episodes. From 1990 to 97 is the light blue, then 2000, 2007 is the dark blue, or blue, 2011, 19 is the dark blue, and then red is the most latest available information. And again, you can simply see the red typically is the smallest bar compared to other bars, which means over the years, annual productivity, labor productivity growth has been slowing across the region, no exceptions, and even globally as well. So one factor, again, you see closely, the typical approach or the reason for success in the region has been structural transformation, right? A lot of countries have managed successfully to move from low productivity agriculture, reliance on agriculture sector, to more industrial bases or high productivity manufacturing and industry, and at the same time having a very outward oriented, export oriented growth strategy, which has worked wonders for many, many countries in the region. That approach may not apply in the future. So what you see is the gross fixed capital formation graph on the left-hand side, pretty strong. Again, same countries, China and India and the sub-regions. But the right-hand side graph, as you see, is showing contribution of gross fixed capital formation to economic growth. And that has been declining or slower. So on the margin, the likelihood of having a big impact on growth coming from further investments in capital formation are not that big. That's the basic point. So where is the growth going to come from? One answer, of course, being talked a lot about is focus on services sectors. And we'll again come back to that. What are we recommending here? So our first policy action we're suggesting is following a developmental state role, which is on the right-hand side. There are broad 5 elements. We have highlighted some case studies in the chapter as well, elaborated a bit more on these points. What exactly do we mean when we refer to the term developmental state? But if you look at the left-hand side, it captures a sort of the dilemma a lot of countries are in at the moment, right? So they're stuck in the middle part of this value chain functions. Production side, the research, the innovation is being done in the headquarters somewhere else, and the post-production benefits, marketing strategy, and reaping the benefits, post-production services are being, again, not focused entirely in the region. And that's where the more value added is happening. So region, I mean, that's the term you normally hear. Region is Asia is the factory of the world, right? So they're production factories. But they are the lower side of the value added. They cannot rely on that. So if they want to go from low value added to high value added, they have to do what we're calling sectoral economic upgrading through a developmental state. That's our first main message. Second one, this is what I was talking about, focusing on value chains and in particular green value chains. These green value chains can actually become a future economic growth engine in the region simply by leveraging what we call unparalleled regional manufacturing value chains, domestic technological innovations, and endowments of critical minerals. The graphs that you see is the share of global green manufacturing sectors. The dark line, dark blue and light blue together is Asia and the Pacific and China. Dark blue is alone is China. Look at the dominance of Asia and the Pacific over here. This is global relative to Europe and North America included. This is where Asia is already led by China, way ahead of the rest of the world. And that's where a lot of room is to try and go after in terms of sustaining long-term growth trends. Coming to the research theme, and I'm a little cognizant of time because I'm going to leave enough time for other speakers and then come back hopefully for a round of questions and discussion as well. So the basic message here is the links are not clear, are rather complex and not very well understood. links between macroeconomic and climate change, essentially, right? So climate change, two parts of it, three in a way. So one is the physical impacts, which is including all the weather shocks and slow onset events that happen because of climate change, and the climate action, the policies, the very policies governments introduce to try and address climate change. So green investments, carbon pricing, green regulations, for instance. They in turn have huge impacts on the different sectors of the economy, like agriculture, energy, infrastructure, tourism, and so on and so forth, and then in turn, macroeconomic outcomes. And there is a loop, feedback loop as well happening. What happening on interest rates or public debt affects government's ability to undertake certain climate actions, for instance, right? So this is the kind of a visual of this complex relationship. There are a lot of implications which we document in chapter 3 in detail. Here I'm only showing two. One is on the adaptation side. So the annual costs to deal with the climate adaptation are quite large, especially in small Pacific Island developing states in the region. Right-hand side is something you see is called the estimated value of stranded assets. Stranded assets being a lot of countries have already invested in certain, like coal, for instance, or other non-renewable or fossil fuel-based sources of energy production, which are the backbone of production sector or growth in general. And they are likely to, these asset values are increasing in the near future. That's one main political reason why the transition is not happening at the pace that I think a lot of us would like to have, because it's not straightforward. You can't just abandon your existing investments in certain assets and start building other kind of renewable energy sources overnight. It's going to be slower because these stranded asset values run in literally billions across Asia Pacific. This is interesting. To me, it was very interesting when I saw it first time. So everybody talks about climate change as if we know the impact of climate change, especially when it comes to macroeconomy. We don't. We know little. And it needs to be explicitly stated. We don't know much. We means economists don't know much. The very basic thing, oh, climate change is going to impact growth. We don't know. It can, it may or may not. What are the uncertainties? Future trajectory of climate change itself is not very settled. There are a lot of estimates, which with a wide range, but we don't know for sure exactly how it's going to play out. The selection, timeframe, and intensity of green policies that different countries across the globe are pursuing, again, varies quite a bit, making it harder to pin down exactly what kind of climate change trajectory is going to take place down the line. With some countries, like US, pulling out of Paris Agreement, for instance. So that shows still the acknowledgement at the global level is not fully embedded. It's not fully internalized into these things. And third, the intended versus the actual impacts of policy actions. Again, not known, right? They're all question marks here. So on the right side, there is one illustration of the range that you see in impact of global warming on GDP. It could be negligible, according to some authors, some researchers, or could be as large as almost 9%. So we don't know. So when, as a policymaker, if you don't know the size of the impact of a potential shock, it's very hard actually to undertake certain policy actions. That's why at times you see delay in reactions or actions. So we did an assessment of readiness of Asia Pacific, right? So by readiness, essentially two parts. One is exposure. Second is their coping ability. The economy that is more exposed, I'm going to define it in a minute, to climate-induced economic risk and has weaker coping ability, and especially in the context of macroeconomic coping ability, we call them, they are less ready to deal with the climate change and green transition. So how do we define that? We take 4 indicators here: average annual loss as percentage of GDP, agriculture value added at risk as a percentage of GDP, the data on carbon intensity, and inflationary impacts due to climate change. They represent the physical risks related to climate change, the transition risks, and the complex multiple risks associated with climate change in the macroeconomic context alone. Over here in the chapter, you'll see all the other countries studied. Here, I'm only highlighting 11 countries, according to our metric, are what we're calling are more exposed. Mind you, they are relatively more exposed. There's no absolute benchmark of if you cross this threshold, then you are more exposed. This is if you are below 65 percentile, that's the white sort of space. Orange is between 65th and 85th percentile, and red is the above 85th percentile. So it's a relative degree of exposure to other countries, no absolute measure. So these are the only 11 countries which we are saying if you are at least having in the two categories, you're either above 65 percentile, we'll include you as being considered as more exposed. Coping ability, we look three different categories of macro policy perspectives. One is, of course, the fiscal side. So for that, we look at the tax revenue to average losses. We look at the climate finance mobilization. And then we look at the sovereign debt ratings, which indicates the ability to raise resources needed to respond to climate change. The second bucket is the monetary and financial preparedness. We have 4 indicators there, and then institutional strength, as indicated by these 3 indicators. All the data and other details are in the chapter itself. We put it together, and this is the final snapshot of the picture that emerges. So you can see you go from left to right on the horizontal axis side. This is going to higher coping ability, and on the vertical axis, we have exposure. So on the lower side, you go south, that is less exposed, and north is more exposed. The color scheme itself is indicative. So red being red, alarming, warning sign. Then it's orange, then it's light green, and then it's green. So the countries in the red box, essentially in this quadrant, are showing countries which are more exposed and have a lower coping ability. And countries in the orange category or yellow are more exposed. However, they have a better coping or higher coping ability. And similarly, less exposed with lower coping ability and less exposed and higher coping ability, which in the context of the discussion is the ideal category you want to be in. You're exposed, yes, but relatively less compared to your peers, and you have a better coping ability. You can see Philippines actually is in the last category in this assessment. Last point is on going forward, what can be done? So very quick word, this is something I was saying, we're gonna just lay it out here and then go in the detail of these things next year, research and publish it around the same time next year. So some climate aligned macro policies and practices are already in place. A lot of countries have already taken certain actions. They're broadly in 2 categories still. One, managing the climate induced economic risks. Other is proactively fostering climate action. And here are the examples of that, both by fiscal authorities and central banks or monetary authorities in general, right? So macro policy makers do have a role to play in actually overall climate change debate. This is not a settled question. I've been to several conferences, especially with central banks, where they think central banks should not have anything to do with climate change. This is not their mandate. They're focused on inflation only and all that. Once you share estimates how climate change over time is likely to increase inflation on average persistently, then they may or may not respond. Similarly, there is a lot of acknowledgement that they can do something about climate change, but exactly how far they're willing to go through the regulatory and other policy changes, that remains to be seen. So this is simply a range of policies that are being considered, have been considered, are being implemented in certain countries, and you can see the details in the chapter. And we're going to expound them in detail next year as well. So while further embedding climate aspects into macroeconomic policies, policymakers should do these 2 things. One, balancing environmental sustainability with socio-economic development. Again, as development economists, this may not sound like a surprise, but a pure macroeconomist sitting in a fiscal authority or Ministry of Finance or central bank, sometimes it's not immediate in many, many developing countries. So they need to mitigate unintended social impacts, the term you hear called just transition. So transition needs to take place. However, there's going to be adjustment in terms of some jobs lost and other implications, which needs to be taken care of very, very carefully. Similarly, navigating macroeconomic climate uncertainties, right? So you need to acknowledge first, as I was highlighting earlier, there is considerable uncertainty, identify the risks associated with both the climate change itself and the climate action policies. And lastly, and we have a long, some discussion there in the chapter, and we had a special expert group meeting on that as well. How you take decisions when you have that much uncertainty? There are different, conventional decision-making cannot work in some circumstances. So one issue we highlighted and discussed in detail is what we call strategic foresight analysis, which is different from forecasting. So you develop different scenarios and then you work sort of backwards. to achieve the desired scenario, what can be done right now and how it can actually impact those things. So we are sharing some examples in the chapter. Countries' policymakers, or specifically macro policymakers, need to consider these innovative strategies. And I stop here. These are the key takeaways from our research for this year, published in the survey. One, which is going to be a hot topic coming months, global trade tensions and economic uncertainty. What is going to be the impact of that on economic prospects of the region in the near term over time? Number two, how to go about dealing with what is typically called middle income trap. Although I personally don't like the term trap, there's no trap. They just happen to experience middle income status at the moment, and they're not trapped by some external force, which tends to be the connotation here, but that's a typical term used. And we highlight certain ideas on those lines, especially focus on state-led economic upgradation and focus on green value chains. Third, on the climate macro nexus, we find, I must mention, 11 countries which have less coping ability to address macroeconomic implications of climate change. We discussed some policies this year which have been adopted, are being considered, can be strengthened more. But in order to undertake them going forward, you need a different kind of decision-making strategies going forward. And the way overall things are happening, both on the trade protectionism front and in terms of pursuing the productivity enhancement and sectoral upgrading, I think the region can gain a lot on inclusive regional economic cooperation. These are not terms anymore. The very multilateralism order that is in place, has been in place since 1945, is actually being questioned now. We can't take economic cooperation, economic integration for granted anymore. But countries and economies are integrated. So there's a lot of value to be had on re-emphasizing inclusive regional economic cooperation needs to be strengthened to promote trade, to promote investment, to promote overall economic coordination in terms of policy ideas and so on and so forth. That need probably has increased much more because the global multilateralism is becoming more and more fragmented, where US has been taking unilateral decisions, essentially dismantling the very system that we have been taking for granted for 80 plus years. So that cannot be taken for granted anymore. So there is a need to talk more on the value of cooperation that it lies for economies, especially in Asia and the Pacific, because the way I see it, all eyes are on the Asia and the Pacific. They are the strongest region globally. They are one of the most innovative regions. They are literally the engine of global economic growth. That's where the innovation is happening across the board. That's where the green value chains are flourishing. So this is the time for Asia to lead. And for that, I think there's going to be need for much more cooperation. So I stop here. Look forward to other presenters' findings and comments, either on this one or sharing of their own research, so we can benefit as well. As I shared, we will be continuing this kind of research for at least one more year. Here is the QR code for the entire publication. Thank you very much for your time and attention.